So today I'm going to review four of my favorite books about J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, the physicist who led the Manhattan Project, and then was brought down by his enemies during a time of communist paranoia and hysteria in this country. Let's start with what is probably the best known biography of Oppenheimer, American Prometheus by Kyber and Martin Sherwin. Now, this is an exhaustively researched book. Martin Sherwin started writing it way back in the 80s. He spent 10 or 15 years interviewing hundreds of people, really getting deep into the archives and doing a tremendous amount of research to flesh out both the character and the scientific contributions of Oppenheimer. And the result generally is probably what could be recommended as the go-to standard biography of Oppenheimer. It is very accurate. It covers all the bases. It ranging from his privileged and sheltered upbringing in New York City to his precocity, his great knowledge of physics as well as other disciplines, his rise as a young star in the pantheon of world physicists, and then, of course, his leadership of the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb project at Los Alamos, finally following his downfall that was orchestrated by his enemies for his communist and left wing ties during the McCarthy period. The writing itself is a little bit of a mixed bag, and that brings me to one of the central issues with writing about Oppenheimer, which is that he was an enormously complex, enigmatic, charismatic man. So, quite apart from writing about his science, an overriding challenge in writing about him is to capture that mystique, that charisma, what really made him tick, what really led to such an overwhelming impression that people usually had of him when they met him. And I have to say that Sherwin and Bird's book, while very authoritative and very well researched, kind of falls short on that front because they don't really get inside Oppenheimer's skin. The writing is a little bit matter of fact and pedestrian at times. So they kind of give you the straight dope, as we say, but they don't really make you feel for Oppenheimer. They don't really make you appreciate what made the man so remarkable. But again, if there's only one biography of Oppenheimer you have time to read, that's the one I would recommend. Here's another biography that I particularly like. It's called J. Robert Oppenheimer and the American Century by David Cassidy, who is a historian of science at Hofstra University. Now, what is unique about this book is that, just like the title indicates, along with talking about Oppenheimer, it also talks about his times and, in particular, about what Cassidy calls the American century. So he talks about the growth of physics, the growth of what we call big science in the United States in the first 50 years of the 20th century, and how people like Oppenheimer really orchestrated that growth, how they played such a key part in it. So he will talk about things like physics education in the United States, the kind of doctorates that were being awarded in the 1920s and 30s, where America really excelled in physics, where it fell short. In a nutshell, it really excelled in experimental physics even in the 1920s and 30s, but it did fall short in theoretical physics, where Europe was really the center. And of course, as we all know, because of Hitler and the rise of Nazism and fascism, a lot of extremely gifted physicists, theoretical physicists, came to the United States from Europe. But that is the focus of the book. It's not just Oppenheimer, but his life and times, and especially the growth of American science. So if that's something you're interested in, not just a straight biography, I would say that this is the most valuable book that you can read about Oppenheimer. Let's get to a third book now, which I think starts to get into territory which is more favorable to Oppenheimer, the man. If you really want to understand Oppenheimer as a human being, and again, if you want to understand what made him tick, what made him such a charismatic and tragic and mysterious character, the next two books that I'm going to talk about really provide an insight into that aspect of his personality. The first one is J. Robert Oppenheimer: A Life by Abraham Peiss. Abraham Peiss was a very well-known historian of science, a writer about physics and physicists who personally knew people like Oppenheimer and Niels Bohr and Albert Einstein and Pauli and Heisenberg extremely well. He was one of the first professors hired by Oppenheimer when he became the director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. And in fact, the two enjoyed a very close professional and personal working relationship during the next 25 or 30 years until Oppenheimer's death in 1967. So Pius, more than anyone else, certainly more than David Cassidy or Sherwin or Bird, had several opportunities to observe Oppenheimer up close to really understand the man, both on a professional and a personal basis. Not only did the two of them discuss physics and trends in physics, but they also were close personal friends. So Pice was invited to Oppenheimer's house for several times, to parties at Oppenheimer's house. He had a chance to really get to know Oppenheimer's wife and his son and daughter well. And he could really understand the tragic part of Oppenheimer, I think, better than almost anyone else. Both the tragedy of his family life, where he didn't really get along that well with his wife, who could be quite an unpleasant person, but also the real tragedy of his life, where this man who had done so much for this country was brought down by his enemies using very unfair means and using in a very unfair environment. So, if you really want to know Oppenheimer as a person, Abraham Pice's book, J. Robert Oppenheimer: A Life, is what you should read. Now, having said that, I think it's important to say that this is not a comprehensive biography or nuts and bolts biography, or nuts to soup biography that covers all aspects of his life from his childhood all the way to his death. But it does do an excellent job covering most important aspects of his life. Again, really focusing on the man as much as on the physics. The last biography that I'm going to talk about happens to be my favorite, and it's probably the least known of Oppenheimer biographies. It's called The Swift Years, the Robert Oppenheimer story by Peter Mitchell. I first read this in college, and what really struck me was the prose style of the book. Like I said, Oppenheimer is a man who was in equal parts a physicist, a philosopher, a lover of literature, a poet. He had a dazzlingly Catholic mind. He seemed to know everything about everything. He was the fastest thinker that anyone had ever met. You could ask him any question about any topic under the sun, and he would usually give you an answer faster than you could ask that question. So that quicksilver quality, along with the very poignant character that he had, the very tragic character that he had, I think it's captured most suitably in Mitchell Moore's writing style. Even the beginning of the book, I think, captures that whole mystique about Robert Oppenheimer and his tragedy. Let me just read the beginning of the book. In its own way, the atmosphere of the apartment where Robert Oppenheimer spent his boyhood and youth in the early part of this century was like Ibsen's Romersholm, that aristocratic estate where voices and passions were always subdued, and where children never cried, and when they grew up, never laughed. So you can see that Mitchell Moore, who was actually a journalist, not surprisingly, brings a novelist's eye for character to his writing. And his book, I would say, is the closest to a kind of fictional style of writing about Oppenheimer that you can imagine. And so again, while not being a very, not being the standard work on Oppenheimer or being an especially comprehensive biography, I would say Mitchell Moore's biography is the most evocative of them all, which really gives you a sense of the tragedy and the poignancy of the man's life. So these are four of my favorite Oppenheimer biographies. There's of course other biographies. Ray Monk's biography is quite good. There's also a biography by Charles Thorpe that casts a light on Oppenheimer's character in the context of the times. It's more of a psychological profile more than anything else. But I would say these four, Bird and Sherwin, Cassidy, Mitchell Moore, and Abraham Pice, these are probably the biographies that I like the best, and that I think taken together paint a pretty complete picture of Oppenheimer, both as a physicist and as a human being.